Hey guys, you got Marcel here. So the other day I was considering some research that I've been working on for a project, and it occurred to me in nature there are some patterns that correlate to some of the things that humanity is going through. It's one of those moments where you think a situation is chaos and there's no rhyme or rhythm to it, it's just sort of all happening. But when you dig into it deep enough and you correlate it to other things, you relate it to other scenarios that are similar to it, all of a sudden just boom, mind blown. It all just dawns on you that there is a system in place, that there are patterns at play. Well, I had one of those moments. It has led me to hypothesize that the concept of dating and pair bonding, the way we know it now in humanity, might actually be coming to an end, or dramatically changing, at least. Now, all the discussion about, it's feminists' fault, or it's MGTOW's fault, or all these other groups that might cause it, or the fact that it's society, all that is irrelevant. I actually believe it is a pattern that happens naturally, and it all boils down to mate selection and pair bonding to a degree. Now, in order for me to kind of explain my thoughts, to pull it all together, I've got to get into a little bit of deep science here. Nothing too crazy, but I'm going to be covering things, just kind of a heads up, like animal penises and bug rape, like insect rape. So, not a trigger warning, I really don't do those, but like I said, kind of a heads up. So what am I getting at here? Mate selection in the animal kingdom. One of the best survival strategies in nature to guarantee the prolonged existence of your species is to actually give a crap about who you breed with. Makes perfect sense, right? I mean, if you bring on somebody into your gene pool that's got bad genetics, that is severely deformed or incapable of sustaining itself, that doesn't make a lot of sense to ensure the best opportunity for your offspring. But being able to select the best partner isn't always super simple. And depending on the species, there is a multitude of different ways that organisms find ways to kind of set the best apart. Find the cream of the crop. You could call it hypergamy if you want to, but it's far more complex than that, and is definitely not always from the perspective of the female. Let's say, for the sake of simplicity, that there are two main ways that nature will separate a quote-unquote good partner from a less than good one, regardless of whether or not it's from the female or the male's perspective. The first way is going to be physically or anatomically, meaning that the health or the worth of the animal involved trying to breed is going to be dictated on whether or not it is physically capable of doing so. Now, you might think like the biggest, toughest bird or lizard gets to breed, and that's not exactly what I'm referring to here. There are situations where a physical component of the animal will actually show its level of health or capability in really bizarre or even unrealistic ways. Forgive the examples here, but consider like a duck's penis. It, along with several other species, including mammals, have long corkscrew, just kind of crazy looking junk that cannot do anything but complicate the act of copulation. Well, one of the standing theories as to why they're like that is that there's sort of an arms race amongst their species. To grow an organ like that takes resources, and every generation that leads into the next is going to want to find a way to select the best males. Well, in the case of ducks, something like that evolves because the female continuously makes it harder to reproduce through the inside of her reproductive organs. Of course, none of this is consciously, though not in all species, believe it or not. Some of them have the ability to kind of maneuver their organs where if a male breeds with them they don't want to, it actually prevents him from copulating with her, where she won't get pregnant. Well, that's certainly not good for the males who fought really hard to get where they are and put a lot of effort into it, surviving up to reproductive age even. So they gradually evolve more advanced male organs to get around that maneuver. Of course, this is all from a Darwin kind of perspective. Over time, the more advanced the male is, the more likely he is to breed and have offspring, which, go on to further make more offspring. But the more advanced the female is on the inside, the better genetic fitness she has because she only breeds with the most effective males based on what she wants or what their capabilities are. It's kind of a tug and pull scenario. So that's a physical example that has little to do with animal behavior. Let's look at the other side of the coin. On the topic of birds, you have nesting. There are a number of species of birds where the male will design a nest that's meant to attract and bring on a female bird. The more elaborate or well-built the nest is, the more likely he is to get the attention of the female. With every generation, the males have to try harder in order to get the same amount of attention that they would get previously from lesser structures, assuming that there are enough males going around to choose from, that scarcity is not a factor. So simply put, it's hypergamy through nest building in birds. It's actually really common. Now, both of the two previous examples, one of them is behavioral, one of them is physical. Their extremes are limited by a careful balance between the female or the chooser's desire to have the best possible pair bonding and the intent to breed in the first place. Obviously, the selectiveness can't be set so high regardless of how the mate is selected to the point where they don't breed at all. When one side or the other gets too extreme, they tide back a little bit in order for the species to survive. Now, whenever those fail-safes aren't in play, when nature just runs amok, takes that selection to the extreme, eventually, assuming that the species survives in the first place, there's a tipping point where something completely revolutionary pops up that changes the game entirely. Here's an example I've used before a long time ago. There's a type of lizard where the big huge male lizard protects like a dozen or so smaller, gray, plain-looking females. And he's a big bruiser kind of guy, right? The males compete with each other in an effort to keep their females all in this little harem area and then only breed with them themselves. Now, when a big one breeds with a regular little female, all of the male offspring are going to be massive. They're going to be this big, powerful type of lizard. But over time, they just kept getting bigger and bigger and more competitive and violent. And it got to an extreme where somewhere there was a split in evolution and one of the males didn't have the genetics that made him massive. In fact, he looked exactly like a female. And because of that, whenever he would breed with all the little females underneath, I'm assuming it started with one, I could be wrong, the big bouncer males wouldn't notice him. And all of the genetic offspring from those couplings would be petite and female looking, like the Justin Biebers of the frickin' lizard world. They sneak right under the male's nose and they're the guise of being one of the females in its own harem. With whatever system goes too far or is too well set for long enough, eventually there becomes a way around it. Insects are a fascinating example of this. Their reproductive organs are ridiculously complex. Don't worry, I'm not going to drag you through all of it, but just for the sake of discussion, think of insects as little balloons. All their organs are kind of floating around in there. They're not designed the same way mammals or larger organisms are. It's sort of almost like an egg where there's the hard outer shell and then the other stuff just kind of floats around inside. Well, for a lot of breeds of insects, some of the ways that they can sort of mate select is by their organelle, by the shape and design of them through the outside. Now, this isn't necessarily just so that one can pick the best of the other, the healthiest or the strongest, although in a lot of cases it is. Sometimes it's just so that they don't accidentally sleep around with the wrong species of insect, because that can happen. They're not very smart. So by having really complex cave-in tunnel sort of designed organs, they can prevent like the wrong kind of couplings from happening. One behavioral trait that's mirrored in the insect kingdom, and you see it in mammals too, when it comes to after copulation, there's something put in play where the next male that comes along isn't capable of breeding with that same female. Once she's copulated once, she's done. She can't have any more pairs or mates. One method, of course, in higher life forms is mate guarding, where the male sticks around. But, sometimes it's as simple as like a plug the guy leaves behind where another guy can't do anything with her. She's physically sealed off. Well, in the case of insects, sometimes their male organs actually have barbs and spines on them. So when the guy is done and he pulls that out, it tears her up. Like, it's physically impossible for her to ever do it again. I know, that's horrible, right? Well, over generations, the females would design themselves to be tougher and more difficult to copulate with in a way of kind of preventing that. and the males would become more aggressive and more, spined in an effort to ensure that it took place. So the runaway extreme of all of this is that, take for example, the bed bug. Nasty little creatures. They get into people's apartments and they live in the sheets and the blankets. Ferocious little bloodsuckers. But there is one fascinating thing about them, and the term for it is traumatic insemination. See, it is theorized that this arms race between the male and the female bugs of her getting damaged and trying to become tougher to stop it, and him becoming more aggressive and more violent in his copulation, led to the point where he no longer uses her reproductive organs. They basically become vestigial limbs. They're not even used anymore directly. More specifically, the opening to their outside is not used anymore. He literally grabs a hold of her and pokes in at any part of her abdomen that he wants. He stabs her like a hypodermic needle, and it just floats around there inside of her until she gets pregnant. Furthermore, she can't even use her reproductive organs for giving birth anymore. She literally explodes, and the little babies come crawling out. But on a happy note, that's not always fatal. Sometimes they do survive the experience. So what's sort of a summary of what we've discussed so far? You got these different processes that take place in nature that occur on their own and either get to a point of balance or evolve into something entirely different. All of this kept in check by the simple fact that if it went too crazy or there weren't a way around it, the species would simply no longer exist. So what would happen if there were no safeguards? If there were nothing keeping it from going to the furthest extreme that it possibly could, and either the survival of the species was guaranteed regardless, or it no longer became a factor, like none of the animals cared? What happens when those checks and balances broke? What happens, for example, in the case of humanity? I'm going to be covering that in part 2. It is available now. I welcome you to click on it right here. Thank you, everyone. This has been Marcel.